Thank you and good afternoon. Next slide, please. This is the story of two journeys. In 1910, William McNeill and his family moved 3 miles along the west coast of Scotland from the town of Largs to the village of Fairley. William, a ship's carpenter, relocated to work in the world-renowned Fife yacht building yard. In 2024, I followed in the footsteps of William, my great-grandfather, in an act of seaside situationism. Next slide, please. William had married Agnes Bowen in 1897, and their daughters Marion, my grandmother, and Isabella were born in 1898 and 1903, respectively. This photograph from 1912 shows the family around the time of their move. Next slide, please. My journey began at 31 Gogo Street in Largs, where the family were living in 1909. The house faces the Gogo Burn, or stream, which separates the centre of Largs from its 19th century new town. The old town, where my family had lived for generations, features mainly tenement-style buildings in an organic layout. Next slide. The new town, by contrast, is a grid of villas and terraces, the most imposing of which overlook the Broomfields, a grassy slope that runs down towards the sea. This green belt separates the genteel ambience of the grand villas from the more rough and tumble world of the promenade. Next slide, please. Eldersley House is typical of the marine villas along the Broomfields. It was built in 1812 and became part of the Eldersley Hotel during the decades that Largs was a busy holiday resort. It's now flats, reflecting the changing economy of the town. Time is circular. Next slide, please. The Broomfields features a prehistoric standing stone, a reminder that people have been moving through this landscape for millennia. The original significance of the stone has been lost, but in local folklore, it marks the site where the bodyguard of the Norwegian king Hako was slain during the Battle of Largs in 1263. Time is layered. Next slide, please. The dilapidated state of this concrete shelter, a more recent addition to the local landscape, is another reminder of the loss of mass tourism, only partly replaced by day trippers and a growing retirement community. Time decays even concrete. The council is currently looking for a tenant with bright ideas for deturning the shell into something useful. Next slide, please. Continuing south on the trail of the McNeills, the built-up town falls away and grassy play areas open up along the seafront. On the day I pass, the dog walkers are out in force. A few cyclists seem keen on the Ayrshire coastal path. In the distance in this photograph, a local landmark called the Pencil, a 20th century monument to the 13th century Battle of Largs. Next slide, please. The battle, which ended Norwegian domination of the islands and west coast of Scotland, is central to the town's identity. However, the spectacle of the annual Viking festival and reminders of the battle around the town is entirely Norse. Images of King Hako, the leader of the Norwegian forces, Viking longboats, cow-horned helmets, runes. But this, curiously, is the symbolism of the losers of the battle. Perhaps even worse, they have been degraded into the Viking-R ! Tourist attraction, the Viking chip shop, and Thor Save Us, the Hako convenience store. The past, however distorted, haunts the present. Next, please. Largs Yacht Haven represents a different seaborne invasion. not Norse raiders, but hobby sailors. According to Yachting Monthly, the Firth of Clyde is, quote, the gateway to some of the most wonderful sailing grounds in the world. Largs, with decent road and rail connections to central Scotland, offers them an ideal home port. Next slide. The road goes ever on. The Ayrshire Coastal Path stretches for 106 miles, or 170 kilometres, along the left coast of Scotland, perfect for any flaneur of the foreshore. At this point, the path is sandwiched between the railway line on the left and the marina on the right, so there are no sea views and very few walkers on the day I passed. The tree cover soon thins out, though, and reveals a very different view. Next slide, please. A field of boat cradles, unused in the summer months, with a forest of masts beyond. The marina was reclaimed from the mud and sand of the estuary, and the car park and offices built on a plateau engineered from a rocky foreshore. This is only the latest human development to reshape the Ayrshire coastline, and a reminder that much of the Scottish landscape might look unspoiled, but little is quite as nature intended. Next slide. The path alongside the yacht haven is decorated with a variety of anchors, floats and sinkers donated by the former NATO base in Fairlie. This amusing display of floats is the first to greet walkers heading north. Next slide, please. Once we clear the yacht haven, a beach opens up to our right, giving a clear view across the Firth to the Cumbria Islands. On the beach is the remnant of a slipway, a litter of concrete and rusty iron, a reminder that time has changed this working coast into a landscape of leisure. Next slide. The coastal path and the railway change places here, with the walkway moving closer to the main road and away from the shore. We are close to Kelburn Castle, home of the Earls of Glasgow and a significant tourist attraction. When I passed, the big event was the Kelburn School of Sorcery, clearly aimed at the Harry Potter crowd. Next slide. Various marine industries have taken over the former NATO base in Fairlie, where in more worried times, a steel net could be slung across the Firth to protect the Clyde submarine base at Faslane and the American Navy base in the Holy Loch from the curiosity of Soviet submarines. The lengthy jetty and immense sheds constructed during the Cold War now provide storage space for yachts in the cold months, advertised as the largest boat shed in Scotland. Next slide, please. My journey takes me into the village of Fairlie, now without its pier. In its heyday, the Clyde herring fleet landed its catch here at the railhead, and steamers left for dozens of destinations on the Clyde and beyond. Now, the stub of the pier houses a sewage treatment plant, and the village is a commuter retreat. Next slide, please. Kelburn Terrace is a quiet backwater tucked behind Ferry Row. William McNeill and his family first lived here when they arrived in Fairlie in 1910. In the mid-1920s, David Chalmers, an electrician from Glasgow, came to the village to install electric power in Fife's yachts. He lodged with the McNeills here, and in 1928 married the younger daughter of the family. In time, David and Marion were my maternal grandparents. Next slide, please. Shortly after Marion left for Glasgow, the McNeills moved to Clyde View at 22 Bay Street, with a view of both the sea and William's place of work in Fife's Yard. This was the house I visited as a child, where my great aunt Ella lived, and which became a home from home for me. For an urban kid, more familiar with paving stones than beach, the shore and the sheds and slipways of the yacht yard offered endless adventure. Next slide, please. William Fyfe and Sons was run by 3 generations of the family from 1790 to 1939, when the yard was commandeered by the Admiralty. After the Second World War, the business was continued in a minor way as the Fairlie Yacht Slip Company. William Fyfe the first, his son William Fyfe the second, and his son William Fyfe the third, designed and launched a total of 1,000 yachts. The third William was regarded as one of the finest yacht designers in the world. The Mariquita, seen here, a 19-metre gaff-rigged cutter, is but one example. Next slide, please. The Mariquita is still sailing and competing in regattas around the world. It's currently for sale at around £3 million. Next slide, please. Times change, and the boatyard closed in 1985. It was demolished and the shoreside buildings replaced by smart flats with big windows. Its only heritage here is a small memorial. The real legacy is the more than 100 Fyfe yachts that are still ploughing through waves around the world, and the high regard in which they are held. In the background to this photograph is the McNeill home at 22 Bay Street. Next slide, please. The first William Fyfe was determined to build yachts that were, quote, fast and bonny. John McPhee, the artist who created the memorial, has captured both these aspects here in a bronze yacht, forever sailing across the Clyde, riding currents and winds to the far horizon. Last slide, please. Finally, the author meets his younger self at the end of his, quote, transient passage through varied ambiances, as the phrase has it. A walk that has demonstrated that time brings change, and what was once home is now heritage. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess to give some context, I'm here to present my research, which takes the form of like a long-term research load. What on the face of it, it looks like a documentary landscape photo project. It's called No Place Like Home. And I'm a fine artist based in Spike Island, some of you might know, in Bristol. And I work across, I'm not a photographer, I don't call myself a photographer. I work across drawing, printmaking, which is what my MA is in, photography, moving image, and I guess like walking, which some people kind of refer to as a type of performance. And so I'm all into multidisciplinary. And I do that to investigate feelings and notions of like identity, belonging, home, definitions of home, what that means, and where that comes from. My experience of place and why that experience is happening, and what's connecting me to certain places and distancing me from others, and kind of wrapped up in the phenomenon of memory. I'm really interested in memory as the medium between us and our experience of place. And a lot of that, well, all of it always begins through my own personal experience. And for this project in particular, the important context of my own experience is the intersection of class and migration. So I'd like to explain a bit of that before I move on to the project itself. Next slide, please. This is me. This is one of the places you can find me, the Spike Island website. If you want to have a closer look at what I do, that's one place. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, like I said, the intersection of class and migration. So for me, that comes from the fact that my parents, and here they are pictured at some point between their migration to the UK in 1974 and my own birth in the early 80s, the fact that they were Portuguese migrants to the UK, and they were Portuguese migrants from the island of Madeira, which means that they were uneducated peasants. They were like farm labourers who came to the UK to work in the British tourism industry in the 70s. And they were bounced around their status here being new to their job, they would bounce around the southwest until they got to a point where they'd been here long enough to take control of their own destiny, and they moved to London. Next slide, please. And they were settled here in Westminster, right in the centre of London. So this is a photo of me and my mum when I must have been about 2, I guess. And they were settled on this council estate in central London. You can see the Thames there in the background. So right in the centre, like within sight and sound of Big Ben. You know, we could walk to Buckingham Palace in like 15 minutes. So right in the belly of the beast, so to speak. Hang on, my computer's on sleep. Next slide, please. And that's where they were settled. And even though, like, I lived in this place that was surrounded by, like I said, Buckingham Palace, Big Ben, like these icons of like British identity, like the visual identity of how London is seen abroad, the area that I specifically lived in, I never saw represented in any kind of format, either abroad or even in the UK. And the only real 2 touch points I had growing up in the 80s, where I saw a kind of version of my own reality reflected back to me. And for those of us in the room who are old enough to remember the 80s, it was either Only Fools and Horses, which was a sitcom set in the council estate, or it was Fawlty Towers, where by pure coincidence, Manuel works in a B&B in Torquay, as my parents did. So their first job in the UK was to work in a B&B in Torquay. And by pure coincidence, Andrew Sachs and my dad were exactly the same height. So there was kind of also this physical resemblance, and they did kind of resemble. Neither of them are with us anymore, unfortunately. I think it's next slide, please. Right, yes. So exactly 40 years. I grew up in London. I left to go to university. I was 18. Exactly 40 years after my parents moved to the UK, I decided to move back to London, having been away for a while. And what I found was that, next slide, please. That's where I grew up, so right in the middle. The actual centre of gravity in London is SE1, so right next to, pretty much as close to the middle as you can get. But what I found is that when I moved back, I'd been pushed to its fringes. I could no longer afford to live anywhere near where I grew up. My parents having passed away before this time, my home had disappeared in a kind of historical sense. And so I was looking for where I could live. Next slide, please. And I'd been pushed out to its fringes. And I became really curious about, like, if I did want to settle in London again, where could I live? Like, where could I feasibly, as an arts graduate with an arts job, where could I, like, feasibly afford to live? And so I got loads of government data and identified the 4 nearest postcodes to SW1 that I could afford to live in. And here they are. And by pure coincidence, or maybe not really actually, I was living in ST25, so I was already in one of them. So I just began wandering around them. Next slide, please. I just began wandering around these areas with like originally a large format field camera, 5x4, so like a big negative. But that was kind of impractical, and I switched to a Mamiya 7, just in case anyone's technical here and likes to know, and if people like to know about cameras. And I was just wandering around them, seeing what these places look like. I guess like maybe in a way, I was kind of trying to envisage what a future for myself and my own children might look like in these places. And what I discovered was that London was nothing like I knew. It was nothing like the place I grew up. It was also, the only thing it had in common with the place that I grew up was it was also a London that I had never seen represented in popular culture. And I became really curious about what it was like to live here, who lives here, what were their lives like. So it started off very much as documenting a physical landscape, and that's important to see what these places look like. But it evolved from that to be a way. I found I was searching for ways to connect with these places, like looking for the familiar. What in these places, if anything, could I connect to? Which is one of the key interests in my practice, is how do we build connection with places? How do we build a sense of belonging? Where does that come from, and why is it necessary? As well as documenting them as physical places, which, as I said, is important. Next slide, please. And as I did so, as I wandered more and more So walking is not overtly an outcome of this project, but it's in it, like it's so in the process. So this is hours and 6 years of walking cumulatively. And as I walked more and more, I found that what I was looking for, like I said, is traces of the familiar. And as I did so, I think what I discovered was it's not traces of the familiar now. What I was looking for was the little boy inside me who holds those memories of home. He was looking for things that he could hold on to, that he might find familiar. Next slide, please. Whether that be patches of grass to play football on, or playgrounds, or ice cream vans. These areas seem to be the places where ice cream men live. So if you've ever wondered where ice cream men live, they live in the outskirts of London. Next slide, please. And so these kind of visual tropes began to just rise out to the surface. These images of childhood, like maybe a parallel childhood, a lost childhood, perhaps. Perhaps I was looking for landscapes in which I could locate the memories of my own childhood. And in doing so, I developed an increased awareness that for me, the physical environment and the feeling it evokes is of utmost importance. You notice that there's no people in this, and that's a deliberate choice. And that's because I found the way I was connecting to places was very much through their physicality, not through their social fabric. And I return to that in a bit. That comes a bit later. When I was taking photos, I wasn't interested in people. Originally, that was a deliberate decision because it changes the nature of the project. And also I wanted to leave a gap for the viewer to fill with their own imagination about what kind of people populate this place rather than being didactic about it and changing it to some kind of social study or portraiture-led project. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Ice cream vans. Next slide, please. When I was about 75% of the way through the project, I was reading Siebel's Austerlitz. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that book or his work, but he's one of the major literary influences on my work. And I found this quote, which says, "I regularly set off to explore the outlying districts of the city, to walk through the empty Sunday streets, taking hundreds of family photographs, as I call them, pictures which in their very emptiness, as I realized only later, reflected my orphan frame of mind." And I started to, it really like triggered something in me, which was that I started to think that what was stopping me from connecting to these places was not only the fact that I didn't know them and they were alien to me, but maybe what was coming to the surface was not the present, but the past. And that what was happening was I was confronting a disconnection that I had always felt at the place that I grew up in. Because of the fact that we were migrants, there was always a distance that we didn't quite feel like we belonged for like loads of different reasons. And so maybe what was coming out in this project was not a lack of belonging here, but was a reliving of a lack of belonging that I'd always felt in my own childhood and I buried. And so that's why the pictures felt so naturally to me empty, because like Austerlitz says, it's reflecting an orphan frame of mind. And because of this kind of disconnection I experienced as I was growing up, I think looking back, what was happening was that because I felt a social distance from the environment which I grew up in, I started to put a lot more weight in the physical environment, in connecting to like buildings, the visual environment, trees, places where I could seek solace. And so this is being now repeated in this project. That's another reason I think why the absence of people came out in the way it did. Next slide, please. So the landscape in these projects is also important. It's not just about my response to it. Because I want to, as in any photographic project which I pursue, it's important for me to convey a sense of place, a sense to the viewer of what these places are like, as well as my response to them. And I mean, there are 4 different places which all vary. And maybe one thing that I kind of noticed as I was walking through them is maybe a kind of sense of neglect which connects them. these are places where kind of the shiny mask of London that we see at the centre kind of starts to slip, and things start to poke out from the background, and you get a feel. I start to get a feel for maybe the ugly side of the city that makes the city. It's essential to how a city works that we don't see in the centre because it's too manicured. Whether that be like design, people creating their own design paths because their community paths aren't serving them. Next slide, please. Look, I'm really interested in little things. I like this kind of tableau. It's very like John Davies, Joel Sternfeld kind of big inspiration for me. But you know, like you've got fences and just like with a cone holding it up because no one can be bothered to fix it properly. These kind of little details. Next slide, please. Suburban pride, which is something that obviously I didn't experience growing up in the inner city, but which I found totally like fascinating. Next slide, please. These kind of huge housing developments which dominate these kind of areas, which are almost like kind of what Marc Auger's kind of non-places come to mind. They all, like you could be in them, you could be absolutely anywhere. You could be in London, you could be wherever. It's very hard to get a sense of place. These kind of like, just they lack kind of lived in feeling, but yet you see like these little hints that people are inhabiting these places, even though most of the time when I was there, they were completely empty, such as the kids' time marks on the doors. Next slide, please. And that's the photographic side of the project. And like I said, for me, it's not just a photographic project on its own. There's a lot going on here, and I want to drop hints to the viewer as to what some of the themes that are being explored are, without being didactic about it. So the project actually combines the photos, but the quotes, which is a key as well. As anyone who knows Steve Art's work, his work is about people, the weight of history and the legacy that the present carries about the past, and people in the present trying to work to understand the past in a way that they can overcome it, but carrying the kind of knowledge already, even if not aware of it, that it's a futile task, that past can never be overcome. And so it's quite melancholic, which fits with my Portuguese background, which is all about looking at the past. But and so another element I combine, I've got the photos, I've got the seaboard quotes, I've got these postcards, and they're a clue to some of the themes in the work, and they are made by, I went round souvenir shops around Victoria, where I grew up, and got postcards and chop them up and digitally compile them into new postcards. And what I'm playing here with is the idea that like the image that we have of London is a construct, but also kind of the fallibility of my own work. My own work is a construct, right? I've chosen to take photos of certain things. I've chosen to leave certain things out. This isn't an absolute truth. And what I've done is I've screen printed in clear varnish on top of them pictures of the tower blocks that I grew up in, that I've drawn, because of the idea that the definition of place is emitting something. And for me, when I was growing up, it was emitting a place that I grew up, there's no visual image of it. Next slide, please. And the last part of the work is these kind of, they're not collages. What they are is, there's two photos here. The one underneath are photos I found in my parents' archive. So my mum passed away when I was 26, and I went through all this stuff and found all the old photos that she recorded. And what I did was I went back to, I chose 6 photos which had particular poignancy for me, and I went back to the exact location in which they were taken, and I took exactly the same photograph in the present day. And I'm playing with the idea, which is key to one of the key themes in my work, is that you can't encounter the present without the past. Like the past is there, it's the medium through which we see the present, our lived experiences. We can't get rid of it. And so when I'm visiting, when I go back to where I grew up, the past is there and it's mediating how I'm experiencing the present. And that's also obviously then true of these new places. Like I'm experiencing these new places, trying to compare them with a home. Next slide, please. Here's another one. Next slide, please. This is my website. Go back one, sorry. I'm trying to compare these new places with a home. And that's where the title comes from. This title is a double entendre. No place like home. On the surface, it's pointing to the fact that these new places don't look anything like home. And that's kind of literal. Well, what that title actually is about is actually maybe the home that I'm looking for, this thing that I'm searching for, this path, never really existed in the first place. And now what's happened is through the machinations of memory, I'm searching for a place that I've constructed in my memory. The way we do, the way our memory works is to amalgamate places to create something that never actually really existed in its own right. And so there is no place like home. This is a futile task that I'm engaged in, and yet it's one I can't give up and I can't not do. And next slide, please. And that's it. This is my website, cliffandriday.cargo.site, if you want to know what I'm up to. And my Instagram is somewhere there. It's Mr. Cliffy Whiffy, which I did when I was very young, and now I can't get rid of. So apologies, but it is memorable. So there's that. Yeah. I think that's it. Oh yeah, here it is, Mr. Cliffy Whiffy. And that's it. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Good afternoon, this is Nina, and I'm going to be talking to Patrick about the work he made and the project 14 minutes diameter is. This presentation will work around the city of Leeds, look at a series of locations within the city network selected to highlight changes that have occurred in the city over the years.
Good afternoon, I'm Patrick, and this walk, a circular walk, connected each of the locations featured in today's presentation, along with others not shown here, and which allowed me to conduct a nostalgic review of the city. Some locations evoked personal memories for me, others awakened older stories told to me by previous generations, but which I had not actually visited in person before.
We would like to invite you on this short tour of a bygone list. Patrick, could you explain how the image on the right of this slide was created?
Sure. As part of the 4th World Congress of Psychogeography 2022, Matilda Guerin presented her project Walking Webs, inviting willing participants to create a web in their own city by walking due north, south, east and west from a chosen central point. Along each of these axes, a photograph was to be taken after walking 10 minutes and 20 minutes respectively. After participating, my walking web, created in Leeds, can be seen here, with the central starting points located on Briggate at the junction with Leeds' oldest street, Kirgate, and the blue and white dots representing how far I have walked along each of the 4 axes. The photographs I took at each point, including the starting point, can also be seen overlaid on the map. Once completed, the web offered the possibility of a large variety of walks, connecting the pinpointed locations in whichever order was desirable. I was sure even then that I would use this map to create walks, but wasn't sure when.
Knowing how long it takes to reach each of these locations, it helps to estimate the size of the city centre.
Yes, I was interested in measuring the city with time instead of distance.
So the work you made earlier this year was part of the festival. So can you tell us more about that?
Well, on 23rd of February every year, the Terminalia Festival invites participants to experience and investigate boundaries and perimeters, named in honour of the Roman god Terminus. And this year, the festival presented an ideal opportunity to circumnavigate the city, connecting all the locations that had been reached after walking for 20 minutes from the centre. I deliberately chose this outer route as it meant I could spend longer walking.
So which direction did you take and why?
Well, as the walk was essentially an update to my existing and quite patchy knowledge of my hometown after living for so many years overseas, I figured that it would make sense to walk clockwise, I was not trying to go back in time. I was trying to bring my understanding of the city up to date.
Okay, although this is a circular walk, the route doesn't appear to be circular on this map. Could you tell us something about that?
You're right, it didn't turn out to be strictly circular. As can be seen from the map on this slide, some of the web creation points ended up geographically further from the centre than others. This is because the 20-minute time limit was strictly adhered to, and some parts of the city feature several road junctions that slowed me down as I walked away from the centre. According to the applied timing, at any point on the walk, it should be possible to reach the opposite side of the route by walking for 40 minutes directly across the city.
Could you tell us something about these photographs? Were you already familiar with these places?
I knew two of these places, yes. The top left photo was taken on Barrack Road, which connects Chapeltown Road to Roundhay Road, and was the site of the old Chapeltown Barracks, constructed in 1820 and largely demolished in 1988, although I never knew of it before. Instead of soldiers lining up on parade, it is more common nowadays to see new cars lined up at the car showrooms there. Referring to the bottom left photo, I worked in the David Beavers operating theatres at St James's Hospital from 1978 to 1980 during a break in studies from art college. Everyone knew the hospital as Jimmy's, and it was featured in a television series of that name in the late 1980s and early 1990s. While I worked there, it was claimed that it was the largest teaching hospital in Europe.
It must have been quite an experience working in an operating theatre for 2 years.
It certainly was. Some of the things I witnessed there kept appearing in my work for years afterwards. On the right is the Fountainhead pub. This replaced the Florence Nightingale pub, which I occasionally frequented after finishing work on Friday, as it was conveniently located just across Beckett Street. The Florence Nightingale eventually closed following a large explosion caused by a gas leak and had to be demolished. The Fountainhead was later constructed a little further down the street.
So these two buildings seem to have been converted from their original use.
Yes, they have been. On the left-hand side, we have the former Regent Picture House on Torrey Road. It opened in 1916 and was designed by Leeds architect Frank Mitchell. The last film to be screened there was The Bounty Hunters, starring Yul Brynner, and then it closed in 1971. It is currently being used as a bathroom tile showroom. On the right, we have the former Princess Cinema on Pontefract Lane, which opened in 1923 and was designed by Leeds architect J.P. Crawford. The final film shown here before closing in 1965 was Roustabout, starring Elvis Presley. Now called Princess Fisheries, the current main feature is Haddock and Chips.
So the standard photo show the river that once flew this. Is that right?
Yes, the River Aire, seen here from South Accommodation Road, as it winds its way towards the city centre and where it is joined by the Leeds-Liverpool Canal, at the canal's final set of lock gates, just behind Leeds railway station at Granary Wharf.
There seem to be a lot of buildings that have changed their function over the years.
There are, and former is starting to be a familiar prefix to use. And here on the left, we have the former headquarters of the Hunslet Engine Company, opened in 1864 in Jack Lane. The building eventually closed in 1995, with the last order being a batch of narrow-gauge diesel locomotives for use on the tunnelling on the Jubilee Line extension of the London Underground.
The building on the right doesn't look in good shape.
Well, this is the derelict shell of Ambassador House, ironically, the former home of the Environmental Health Services. I wonder what they would have thought of the building now.
So here we have 3 photographs taken in the environment. What attracts you to these locations?
Well, the top left-hand photograph shows a rainy day on Holbeck Moor and a fork in the path. On the way from the city centre to football matches, Leeds United fans would take the path to the left, which leads to the football ground, Elland Road. The circular walking route I was following took the path to the right, along Domestic Street towards the west of the city. For the photo on the bottom left of the slide, we have a footpath under construction alongside the busy Armley Gyratory Road junction. I find it very interesting how spaces are delineated and demarcated during building work. At the present time, it resembles an outdoor installation of site-specific art pieces and is probably more visually interesting than the final state will be.
The large photograph shows a churchyard wall. What did you find interesting here?
This image shows part of the churchyard wall of All Souls Church in the Blenheim area of Leeds. It set me thinking that our knowledge of a place is often constructed from personal experience and stories passed down from previous generations, and we combine these fractured elements into a coherent understanding of that place. Sometimes we also catch glimpses of how the physical world around us changes and fractures as the ground itself moves over time. These changes can happen suddenly, but more often occur over long periods of time, so we hardly notice them taking place.
This final image lets us feel how the weather was on the day of the walk.
Yes, it rained for most of the day during the walk. At one point, there was a pause in the weather, and a rainbow appeared above a residential block with the poetic name of Echo Central, and I managed to catch the image as I passed. For a while, the walk seemed to be heading for the left-hand end of the rainbow, but I never managed to reach it. Not this time anyway. We could always try again another day.
Well, thank you for introducing us to some of the interesting things you saw on your walk.
You're most welcome, and thanks to everyone listening to this presentation.
I just wanted to say that besides the personal memories that were evoked during this walk, I thought it was a good example of how participating in others' work can actually trigger or even act as a catalyst for your own work as well. And I think hopefully if somebody participated in anything I created or initiated may go away and produce further work and so on. It's like a passing the baton, you know.
Thank you for having me. My name's Steve. I'm a Welshman living in Canada, and I'm pursuing a PhD in critical studies and improvisation. My research is looking at the overlaps of belief, ritual, improvisation, and the development of the relationship to place. Through no fault of, I don't have slides to show. You could look at my face, or since the presentation is really about relationship to land and place, I do notice that there are windows in the room and you've been staring at screens for a lot of the time. So please, if you want to sort of move yourselves around, try and get some fresh air and fresh light into your eyes. This presentation, this talk is a snapshot of a process that applied a hybrid derived practice in conversation with archival materials as a form of place-based research, and that place specifically being the University of Guelph campus in Southern Ontario, where I've worked and lived since 2019. I'm not from here, I'm not from where you are, I'm from Swansea, so I think it's worth saying just a few words in response to Hiraeth. It's that sort of gnawing, ineffable sense of longing that is supposedly deeply human and uniquely Welsh. Robin Chapman, in his Welsh Keywords article in the now defunct Planet magazine, identifies a point in 17th century Welsh history where Hiraeth is not conceived as a site of impossible return, but signifies a longing for a future as well as a past. And it's this sort of dual-visioned Hiraeth that I feel influenced the Homecomings project, but started life with the name Hiraeth Terra Nullius. The project took place on the site of University of Guelph in April 2024. The site itself has been everly present and shifting since the establishment of the Ontario School of Agriculture in 1874, growing into a small township of colleges, research labs, residencies, and other off-campus campuscules. In the midst of lockdowns, I found myself drifting through university archives and found caches of videos, images, written testimonies of various hazings, beginning of semester disorientations, and the sometimes cruel and questionable pranks launched at freshmen by vengeful second years. There was actually an English aristocrat who was put into a pig cart and brought downtown and auctioned. So some of the nasties were actually against the people from British Empire. But these archives bear witness to a ludic beating of the bounds, which reinstates over generations of students senses of hierarchy, authority, and importantly, relationships to land. One in which land is acted upon, that is manipulated, sought, and found as a resource. For Sandy Grand, the Academy, considered as a bundle of social practices, quote, functions as an apparatus of colonization, one that refracts the eliminative practices, modes of governance, and forms of knowledge production which define settler colonialism. As a participant in the cultural genocide of First Nations in North America, the placing and expansion of academic spaces like the one I'm intimately connected to are spaces complicit in the denial and destruction of bodies, their knowledges, and the land-based relations in favor of European-style agriculture and associated sciences and arts. So like many immigrant researchers, I've yet to establish or develop relationships with communities which would allow me to use local vernacular, cultural or land-based practices to unsettle and reframe my own Eurocentric practices, which owe sort of a theoretical and practical inheritance to the Dreve and Swansea city centre. But instead of that, sort of following this sort of backwards-looking, forwards-looking Hiraethian viewpoint, and also following invitations from Ben Spatz and Heather Davis Finch, I've sought to remix and reinvent my drifting by seeking past practices, trainings, and vocational inheritances. And a practice which I've found incredibly useful, a sort of part of my psychogeographic toolkit, is some of the tools found in anthropocosmic theatre. Anthropocosmic theatre has been developed over 40 years by Helena Gardner and Nicholas Nanez at the Theatre Research Workshop, or the TRW in Mexico. It's been developed through encounters with Tibetan Buddhism, Stanislavski actor training, Grotowski's post-theatrical actions, and an embodied connection to pre-Hispanic Mexican ritual theatres. It consists of a participatory framework offered as actor training and as vehicles for personal psychophysical development. Obviously, the question is raised, what's a Welshman doing in Canada using a Mexican theatre practice to reorientate the Parisian Dreve? And what I guess I can say it's Huddersfield University's fault. I both took part in sort of a ritual-based street Dreve at one of the previous Fourth World Congresses, and on the same campus, and within about 3 weeks, I was introduced to anthropocosmic theatre and sort of found between them just a lot of sort of kinship, particularly in their the anthropocosmic theatre's two foundational peripatetic tools, and the Homecomings borrows as sort of its throw a spanner in the works, basically. And those two tools are contemplative running, also known as contemplative trotting, and slow walking. They're both non-virtuosic practices like the Derive, and they claim a shift in perception, quote, in such a way that participants can acknowledge their co-responsibility with the rhythms of the universe, with all its social and political implications, which is quite a claim. The trotting and the walking provide an opportunity to reframe one's relationships beyond the anthropocentric towards the more than human. And it's these tools that I sought to test out through the Homecomings project. The two tools are relatively simple invitations to walk and to run in continuous flowing motions. The contemplative and slow walking practices are calls to awareness, to move in exaggerated moments that require effort and presence. They're not to be misunderstood as thinking while running or walking, akin to the Derive. Rather, they are practices that should be read as a task which is concentrated solely on the activities themselves, much akin to Zen meditation. So, in an attempt to unsettle the potential neo-colonial and materialist renderings of the Derive, I added these tools to a psychogeographical playbox and applied them to campus with a cohort of 4 third-year students in the university, none of which have performance as their major. And for 3 weeks, over 3 weeks, sorry, the project incorporated a scattershot approach with multiple instances of anthropocosmic trotting, slow walking, drifting, studio and place-based playing, loitering, and, just to keep everyone involved, the occasional TikTok binge. We also made visits to explore the archives, and the artifacts became scores that guided our explorations of the site, psychogeographic markers and that help us wayfind the university in new and unexpected ways, sometimes providing images to take 180-degree turns away from, at other times opening wormholes of spontaneous reenactment and imaginative transference. I acted not so much as a director, but more as an accompanist to the process. I invited and gave room for the cohort's development, curation, figurative and literal cutting up, mashing up and restructuring of mine and their practices. The devising prompts I made with them, and the project culminated in sort of a creation of a non-linear guidebook to place and time. We all sort of probably, I would say, since we're all here, have a sort of a working knowledge of the Derive and psychogeographic processes, and we probably use them or interested in them or read about them. So instead, I'm going to focus on what the participants reported as the influence of the anthropocosmic theatre tools, as I feel they provide a strategy alongside and entwined with the Derive through which to re-establish a relationship to place that might be helpful for those seeking such a shift in perspective. So this following short account, again, is a snapshot of a process. It's mid-formation. It's constructed from my own notes and interviews with participants. So overall and overwhelmingly, the participants reported sensing an expansive notion of their body in place and their body as place, a felt understanding of their responsibility to the past, to current and future beings, and the importance of their moment-to-moment decisions in both sustaining or potentially subverting the academy and their role within it. Before going into the archives, there had been many questions of their importance and relevance. However, our collective immersion in the rhythmic, repetitive trotting of anthropocosmic trotting, as well as providing an embodied ballast for the more fluid, veering spontaneity of the drifts, provided an experiential understanding when viewing the events described and documented through text and image-led languages of the archives. The rhythms of our trotting could be recognized in the repertoire of annually restaged events, leading to reframe the campus itself as a network of rituals, summed up by one participant very succinctly as revolving around, quote, royalty, religion, education, and war. With the cohort consisting of digital natives, it was really noticeable how one participant reflected that they had never experienced silence before their engagement with these anthropocosmic tools, because, quote, consistently in our day and age, there really is no silence, end quote. This reflection from a participant put me in mind of Phil Smith's invitations to psychogeographic pilgrimage. It also made me think of Roland Grimes's article Grotowski as Pilgrim, as two potentially kindred journeys away from the scientific, from the categorizable, and toward an intimate source that refuses enclosure and extraction. A profound reframing of dualistic perception pervaded much of our drifting, causing my well-made plans to become derailed in favor of attending to the environment in sympathetic and reverential ways. One of these spontaneous detourments occurred en route to War Memorial Hall, a site that before the redevelopment of the campus in 1960s was central to student cultural and social life. And to imagine the campus, if you imagine like Old MacDonald's farm meshed with the landscapes seen in Clockwork Orange, that's sort of what the campus looks like. So after standing in, so on our way to this building, everyone stopped mid-walk, and we found a dead bird that had either sort of flown into a window or been sort of heat-stricken or a combination. And instead of going through my well-made plans, over about half an hour, we sort of constructed sort of an improvised ritual, resting the bird outside War Memorial Hall before going into War Memorial Hall and continuing to improvise over several hours a sort of elegy for the fallen bird. The participants described this as a sort of surreal yet meaningful ritual, and helping in it that it helped to recenter forgotten relations and respect to the more than human, not so much by stripping away layers of human-centered histories, but refocusing all those endeavors in the complexity of the everyday life and rhythms of the campus. The anthropocosmic drifts continue to resonate after the project is finished. One participant reported conceptualizing and sort of feeling the campus as a bundle of intersecting rituals, as, quote, a staged managed cyborg come ship of Theseus, end quote, a sort of amalgamation of human and other than human entities continually ever presently in flux. And again, the reportage is that these are being felt on a more than intellectual basis in sort of like a palpable sense of one sort of organic involvement within these processes. So this imaginative reflection echoes Lepaperson's theorization of the academy as an assemblage that's ripe for subversion towards decolonizing purposes. The anthropocosmic drifts, I feel, is one effective strategy towards realizing this assemblage, both up close and intimately. And to paraphrase Lepaperson, it can be seen as a theory and practice of action that both accounts for and illustrates the permeability of the academy, or indeed any institutional space, or any human-built space, and realizing it as a part of an apparatus of power, and also recognizing its potential recovery as a dynamic braiding of relations. So I got 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to offer just a little sort of cover all. That was quite a scattershot and rushed review, so thank you. So the anthropocosmic drifts, in our opinion, invites a dual step of intellect and feeling, a middle grounding of fleeting yet expansive pockets of experience, which are visceral and renew one's appreciation for what Lavery and Whitehead might refer to as an ecology of place. That is the experience of encountering where one inhabits with renewed attention and a sense of the responsibilities and reciprocities that exist between the animate, the inanimate, the human and non-human agents, past and present worldviews that surround one and constitute the world, allowing a fluid play amongst different layers of institutional history, performance trainings, and social emplacement. So the Homecomings research team also found the application of these contemplative tools to critical walking help reframe perceptions and relationships between body, memories, positionality, both to the environment and other beings. And if these fleeting yet expansive senses of interconnection with persons and environment brought through this sort of hybrid drifting might equate to feeling the world the right way up, or to paraphrase Kathy Turner, to temporarily recall and realize the expansive possibilities inherent in everyday life. My further sort of investigations and sharing of this process is to ask, how might we continue to authentically integrate that type of knowledge in our lives and our research, whether we are at home or not? Thank you.
This is a project I did in 2022, and I was working with a researcher in life sciences at Greenwich University, and it had 3 parts to it. And the first part was a walk that a very diverse group, small group of residents local to Woolwich took individually. So they took solo walks. They all walked the same route. We gave them the route, but they walked on their own, and they responded to prompts about how safe they felt, about their memories, and about how environmentally friendly they felt that part of Woolwich was. And they recorded their responses just into their mobile phones. So you will hear the sound quality of that at certain points. And this we were also responding to, if anyone knows Woolwich, it's had a lot of recent developments in the dockyard area. And there's basically a main road that separates the old Woolwich and then this new, incredibly sort of pristine, wealthy development. And it's literally like the main road is like this river that you have to cross between the 2 areas. So we were also very interested in how that's really changing the identity of Woolwich. Part 2 was I listened to all their recordings, and I then created one audio track that we all could listen to. We all took the walk together, listening to the medley of people's responses, so the different and similar responses to the same locations. And then we all convened and chatted, and it was very, very lovely to see actually how these people bonded and communicated so quickly. The final part is this, which is a creative response using the pathway of the walk. It's a sort of creative documentation of the walk using their sound recordings that I made. I collaborated with a couple of other people, including Matt, who is here. I think that's enough. Thank you.
Let's play.
Yes, press play.
Great.
Oh.
Hang on. Here we go. Something's happening. It's off.
Oh, yes.
I started my walk from the Bathway Theatre.
You know what's really cool about the Bathway Theatre is last time I was here, I got shown that if you pull up the flooring, you can see the old baths because they just built the theatre over the top of it, which is really cool.
Starting at the Bathway Theatre, first of all, I didn't even know this existed in Woolwich, even though I think we've been here about 12 years now. Never actually been up this area of Woolwich.
I'm opposite the Bathway Theatre at the start of the walk. I'm standing in a suite of tall brick buildings. This area has a quite old atmosphere, as there's very few people for such a sunny day. The buildings are nice to look at them. They've got loads of stone carved ornaments, and I think the suite is designed pretty well. So I think the only reason that there might not be that many people is there's a complete lack of nature. There's no plants or planters. I drove across the busy Woolwich High Street with all the shops like Panel. This street is always fairly busy with shoppers. I noticed quite a few people that weren't there just for the shops. They were just sitting under the trees on the benches along the roads, just socialising, which makes the street feel more welcoming.
On the left, opposite the little, is there a bit tight now. There used to be quite a nice old Victorian school building, and they knocked it down and proposed various projects for it. It's just a nice sort of thing, isn't it?
This must be Marylebone Park, Janet.
The landscape, the park looks amazing, very welcoming. The fresh air in the environment is amazing, very, very comfortable.
Now I'm walking through the barracks towards the river. These buildings, well, they're called the barracks because they used to be army barracks, but now they've been repurposed into flats and other workshop spaces. It's a really clear example of sustainability in the village.
It's a fantastic building. It's part of the old munitions factory. Now it's just full of great big spaces for people to do whatever they want. It's very lively. I like it.
It's weird being in these long statues. You can hear the wind really strongly in one ear, and then the other is all blocked. Reminds me of like when you're kind of half in and half out in the world, like when you're listening to things on your headphone, you're in like a really busy space or something. I think it's that vibe of only half being where you are. Yeah.
Not sure I like these great big fat cement balls.
I like the grey spheres. They're playful. They make me feel like a kid.
Well, it'd be lovely to see these beautiful buildings being used for people to live in. I have a feeling very wealthy people living into woods now. And lines of very sleek cars. Gives me a whole different feeling. And on my left, there's a gated community. So you can only get in if you've got the code. Well, I don't like that.
It's quite interesting. There's a Sikh temple at the top, which represents like Woolwich is like a really sort of multicultural town. There's also like Buddhist temple, I think, as well as like a Catholic community. It's quite sort of diverse with different communities like Nepalese, Vietnamese, Asian, African communities. So there's quite a diverse mix as well as like European.
This is General Square. It was, I don't know, 4 years ago, it was there before. There were these great big dark ugly trees and an old fountain, and there were rats everywhere. I think it works well as a sort of as an open space. It feels like a space for everybody and anybody. They've got the TV screen over in the corner. And this is the Woolwich Centre, which has got the library and all the council offices.
And I love the old town hall building. Years back, when my aunt actually got married when I was younger in Woolwich Town Hall. So there's really weird, vague memories of it when we moved here, because I was about 6 or 7, and then Skylar, when we had him, we registered for him to get his birth certificate there. So it's like this cycle of being born in this area, watching Mark get married at Canterbury, and then coming visiting this area. So that was quite strange that there was that sort of cycle from weddings, births, death in this area.
What I failed to really talk about when discussing Woolwich is my own very personal memory of it, which was that I was married there. I was married to Peter, and we frequently went there because Peter loved Woolwich. Our marriage was a crazy one. It was very hippie. I was in a rainbow-coloured frock. Peter was in a caftan of sorts. We didn't have a reception. We had a very big party. Well, I suppose that was a reception, a 70s reception, if you like. There was a crazy party. Everyone behaved wonderfully badly and very merrily. It was the beginning of many adventures.
It's a long time since I've walked around in Woolwich looking at it. Like I said, I so enjoyed my 2 days walking around here. So I'm very grateful that this project came my way.
Learning more about the area and seeing it through like different eyes, and then sort of noticing more about the buildings and different things that I wouldn't normally notice. So I was paying a lot of attention more around to everything, and I really enjoyed it.
Just focusing on looking at specific things. It's like, I think that really helps you, but if distracting something, thinking about specific things, if you give yourself a few things to try and take notes of when you're walking, I think that can really benefit you.
For me, I get to listen to other people's stories.
Yeah.
There are many areas around the area, and I see the diversity in that source and opinion.
Just makes an added value to the experience rather than just looking at it.
Yeah, I was really grateful for the walk. I really enjoyed doing it just before sunset and seeing Woolwich. And I love people watching and seeing all the different people about. And I was out for sports in there.
It's an absolutely wonderful day for clouds. And whenever I see clouds like this, I'm reminded of being a child and lying on my back for what seemed like hours, making shapes out of the clouds and wondering how I could get up there and be amongst those wonderful shapes. And I feel exactly the same, but I'm not lying on my back. I'm leaning against a very firm post and looking up.
Did you enjoy it?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, so I mean, it's obviously, and the film excellent as well, like a really good way of exploring what home is. Does anybody have any film?
Just a very quick comment, and I think it's a clear through, sorry to the others, because quite the paint is great, and connecting all together is difficult. Just in relation to yours, I think you were saying something like, there isn't a lot of cultural representation of the Edgelands. Was that specific to London or generally? Because I think one thing that when I saw some of your wonderful photographs, stylistically very different, but I was thinking about something like George Shaw, who does those wonderful rock paintings at the outskirts of Coventry, and he has those same sort of kind of depopulated landscapes, and which look kind of a bit run down, a bit depopulated. But he's always making the point, which is about his memories of growing up in this place and what looks like a kind of abandoned block of garages was this home, this playground, and it's got those kind of feelings for it. So his paintings are really kind of ambivalent. But for me, they're really kind of an interesting representation of edgelands. So I just wondered if you were kind of, you're just thinking about photography and just London, or it's a bigger statement about the edgelands.
No, I was, I mean, it's a good question. It's things that I'm still very much thinking about working through. I think with those areas in particular, like, you've got, it's a Marion Short.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. You've got the definition of edgelands. London's interesting specifically because that definition doesn't really fit. Because those areas were once upon a time edgelands, but the city has kind of migrated beyond, like expanded beyond them. So they exist in this weird kind of limbo where they have the elements of edgelands, but they also don't. They're kind of this unique entity in themselves. When I was talking about cultural representation, I was thinking more like on a kind of mass cultural level. So sure, like in like educated art circles and stuff. And I was thinking more when I was a kid, in like terms of mass culture and like these kind of big cultural products which contribute to the idea of what London looks like, what is English, what's English identity kind of thing. I think those kind of levels, these micro images of different flavors and places in this thing, for sure on like a more artistic and niche level.
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's a guy called Gareth Millington who's written about kind of the Essex edgelands and writes about Thurrock and stuff, and he talks about Anglia Island and stuff. Feels like Fishland, they've kind of reached some sort of audience, I think, and that's where I grew up with a bit of. That's kind of stunning edgelands that used to be kind of the posh edge of London, and then it's become the multicultural, the diverse kind of edgeland. Yeah. And I think their films kind of bring that sort of wide audience.
Yeah.
Please. Yeah, I mean, picking up on an earlier discussion about unstable places, which you were earlier on sort of identifying the places of crime. But as you say, like the George Shaw bits of Coventry, which I know well, and the way that those kind of supposedly kind of run down, dodgy looking places are also playgrounds. They're also where you make your den and whatever. And I think that's important to kind of, sort of recognise that. Phil earlier on, I think, talked about the way that the unstable places are kind of weaponised as a means to kind of police and clamp down on those spaces. But I was interested, because you said, and you might have a perspective on this, Helen, you talked about the way that in central London, there was such a management of space that it didn't really allow these kind of contradictory spaces. But I went to Woolwich, to that area, because Punchline, the show I had to go there for professional reasons. And but I wandered across that big road but I could find dodgy, funny or contradictory spaces in the posh bit, as well as in the. So I just wonder whether you have a perspective on that these highly managed areas sometimes, because it takes so much money and so much effort to fully control, that there are these little voids that open up even there. Does that make any sense or not?
Yeah, it does. I feel like the city is its own energy, right? It defies so much planet, or this kind of organic growth of somewhere as huge and massive as London is its own energy. So you can try and control it, but it will keep growing in unexpected ways.
I wonder whether Francesco Carrera's idea about voids is more helpful than edgelands, because edgelands sort of implies that you've got to be in the margins for it, whereas voids, which is where the sort of productive use has disappeared or has degraded or whatever, but there's a sort of surplus left in a kind of emptiness and this
maybe that ties in with Patrick and Nina's exploration of Leeds, those spaces. And I went there a few months ago, and you can see that they've been stored spaces for some time, but now it's just intense change. But yeah, it's interesting to compare places.
I think I was being a bit reductive saying that, like, of course, like in the central London vibes, like, you know, basically, you know, you go down like a back alley and the mask is definitely split. You know, for the sake of like brevity, I kind of was being a bit reductive. But Woolwich is like an interesting example. So Woolwich actually came up as one of the areas I can afford to live in. And it's only because of the historical geography of East London that boundary is very much near the centre. So E13 Plaistow is by far the nearest one. You know, East London being traditionally the coast area, but Woolwich would have been the next one. I think Woolwich is interesting because it is like a frontier of old London, if you like, to be simple about it, and then like this massive new gentrifying development. The two are coming into contact, and like you're saying, as much as you try and keep them apart, that's what people try and do. They don't. They lose to them. They affect each other.
I was interested in the project in Woolwich had these preconceived ideas about the conflict between these two parts of Woolwich, and I actually didn't find that at all. I found that they were merging much more. People that lived in Woolwich for a very long time were quite happy with this new development and the changes that were taking place. And people that had just moved into this new area were, you know, very happy moving across that road. It was much more integrated and far less the horrors of gentrification than I perhaps had anticipated.
I've got a question for you. So you said that this is the first time you'd attended this in person. So
Yes.
How did the other psychogeographical gatherings inspire what you did with that film? How did it make you do what you did?
Gosh, I don't know if I can articulate it. It's I think I feel like I'm still sort of searching down that road. It inspired me to think about place differently, and certainly, like a lot of people, I've walked a lot more during the pandemic and followed a lot of sort of scores and prompts and things, and Sonia's distance drift and things like that. Start to do that. So I started to think myself about how I relate to spaces, which spaces I'm avoiding because I might feel afraid of them without even consciously realizing that. One of the things I'm interested in sort of performance is the kinesthetic response. Some of it's conscious and some of it's unconscious to architecture, to space, and how can we make that conscious. So then I was interested in other people and how they would respond, and the reason, and also these questions that you ask a lot about memory and community. So there was a sort of conscious thing, particularly coming out of the pandemic, of asking people to walk separately, then asking them to walk together.
Yeah.
I've had those very different experiences of the walk and of how can our sense of place help create connection between people, and those were ideas and questions I think that came from them. Yeah, they're different.
In what you saw, and also speak, how many people were there? Were there any differences in setting according to gender or age?
Fewer than I am.
In terms of threat and age?
Yes. Yeah, far fewer than I anticipated. In terms of threat, and there was a general agreement about which areas felt more scary than others. The youngest person involved was a 17-year-old teenage boy and he was the only one that had actually been remarkably phone more than once. Which again was interesting because the women talked about threat a lot more, but it was the teenage boy that had in fact been